I'd like to call to order the St. Helena Planning Commission meeting for April 7th, 2015, and ask Commissioner Kistner to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If we could have roll call.
Commissioner Sweeney,
Present.
Kistner,
Present.
Monette,
Here.
Chairperson Parker.
Present. And
Matthew
Commissioner
Heil.
Heil is not present. He has family commitments this evening. Moving on to the approval of the minutes from March 17th, 2015. Do we have a motion to approve or any edits?
So moved. Second.
Commissioner Monette,
Yes.
Kistner,
Yes.
Sweeney,
Yes.
Chairperson Parker.
Yes. Moving on to public forum, this is an opportunity for the public to address the Commission on items of interest to the public that are not listed on tonight's agenda. Because of restrictions imposed by the Brown Act, the Commission may not engage in discussion nor take action on matters not described on the agenda. Would anyone like to speak at public forum?
Hi, Jeff Ellsworth, 1434 Sylvaner. I just want to continue letting people know about a county coalition that's been formed of citizens groups. It's called Napa Vision 2050 to address residents and citizens' concerns regarding water, traffic, and development, to help keep an eye on the processes on the county level and in the municipalities. So it's Napa Vision 2050. The email address is napavision2050@gmail.com. Once again, that's napavision2050@gmail.com. People can get in touch there or feel free to get in touch with me directly. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak at public forum?
Good evening, commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Gilbreth, and I'm here to request that you agendize, if you would, for your next regularly scheduled meeting on April 21, I believe, to discuss the potential for a general plan amendment and a rezoning as it relates to, in my view, an incredibly unreasonable element which restricts parcels to 1/2 acre in size. You may recall that I was here regarding the Fulton Lane subdivision, and a number of neighbors were concerned about the entire process, but also expressed a concern about the limitation contained in the general plan, which seems to me, and I think some of the neighbors who will speak on this as time goes by if you continue with it, to be absolutely inconsistent with the agricultural goals in the general plan areas. I've never seen it in my career. There is some rationale for it, but it makes no sense to me. So I was hoping that you could put this on your agenda so that you could comply with the Brown Act, have a discussion, and have an opportunity to consider in greater detail the merits of this proposal and staff's comments. So I'd appreciate it if you could do that. I think it will be beneficial to the community, and I have gone to the other areas. And in essence, what happens is you want open space in your agricultural areas, but because of this constraint, you end up with a 1/2 acre. That's something that you would see normally in a subdivision. And in this particular case, the approval allowed the 1/2 acre to be right on Fulton. The owners of the property, my clients, desire to work with the city and the neighbors and create a much larger parcel. They have 14 acres. And the residue there was 13.63 and the 1/2 acre, and they would propose many more acres for the smaller one, 4 acres, something like that. I'm not quite sure. We have had some discussions about that. And then the house would not be located on Fulton Lane. And I believe that the city has been constrained previously when there were approvals of other lots that are over near the community college. And I took a trip out there, and they looked to me, again, very inconsistent. And I also went over to Crane Park and saw something similar. So I'd just like you to consider all of that, if you would, on an agenda item, and then you would hear all of the issues pro and con on that. I do think we would get support from the neighbors in general. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Victor?
Yes, if I could just kind of step in here or add what the speaker is requesting. They're not looking, obviously, for action from the commission on this. Simply the request is to consider to discuss the item at the next meeting. At that meeting, there wouldn't be any sort of action on the item. The focus of the discussion would be essentially whether the commission thought it was worth initiating a formal change to the general plan and zoning to address the issue. So if it's the commission's pleasure or desire, it would be appropriate, to simply get direction. You don't have to have like a formal vote, but maybe just sort of a head count as to whether that's an item the commission would like to explore further, as to whether there's any merits to looking into the issue. Obviously, looking into it doesn't imply a commitment to modify it, simply to explore it. Just from a staff standpoint, I think there is merit to looking at it. Arguably, one could argue that it could wait until the general, as part of the overall general plan update. But so that's one way of looking at it. The other, but in a lot of ways, it is kind of a standalone issue. So.
And I agree. I think that any issue is worth at least looking into. My only concern is the calendar that evening and if there's space for the item. And
There would be room.
okay. Yeah. Then that's fine to agendize that. Thank you. I actually think it would be very appropriate because there's the general plan update meeting the week before. So everything will be very fresh general plan wise.
And what we can also do is do a courtesy notice to the neighbors out in the Fulton Lane area, so that as part of this, simply the discussion to consider whether to initiate it or not, they could participate.
Agreed. Thank you so much for thinking of that. Would anyone else like to speak at public forum? Seeing none, I'll close public forum. Moving on to the consent items, there are none. Public hearings, there are none. And then finally, moving on to tonight's only agenda real item is the housing element study update. If we could get a staff report on this. And we do have a few other structural things that Victor and Aaron are going to bring up just so everyone's up to speed this evening.
Sure. Let me just kind of set the stage here a little bit. This is the second Planning Commission study session on the housing element. The first such study session occurred on February 17th. At that time, the Commission provided a number of comments and direction, forwarded those to Council. Council then, on February 24th, made some amendments to the housing element as it was drafted, and staff incorporated those changes, and that is the version that we then sent off to the state for comment. To date, we have not yet heard back from the state, although we've been in communication with them. We just don't have a formal comments back from them yet. And staff did provide, albeit belatedly, copies of the latest version, the February 24th version, which is the most current version of the housing element. So the Commission should have copies of that. And there is both, the Commission also has copies, and there are copies in the back of the room of a comparison paper, which is done in track changes format, that shows essentially the changes the council made to the February 17th draft document. So if you've looked at the February 17th document, which is the first one the Commission looked at, and if you look at those track changes document, that will get you up to date on what it was that was sent to the state. So the other thing the council did on February 24th was to give kind of some follow-up for both staff and for the Planning Commission. The council was aware that the commission was interested in having a second study session. One of those items, which is really more of a staff item, is the council requested that staff contact the various property owners that have are identified sites for affordable housing, engage their interest in terms of actually building affordable housing on those properties, and staff is in the process of doing that. We're just getting started, so we really don't have anything to report on that. Although we will, when this comes in front of the housing element comes in front of the commission. The other two items the council wanted feedback on, which they wanted feedback from the commission, revolve around the whole issue of second units. And frankly, most of the amendments that council made to the draft housing element, the February 17th version, revolved around the issue of second units. And the issue, or question council raised was whether it was the appropriateness of using deed restrictions as a way to ensure affordability of second units, and whether such deed restrictions should be tied to incentives to encourage the construction of affordable second units. And then the other item was simply wanting the commission to explore possible incentives for commercial developers that may want to build on-site housing in conjunction with their development project to obviously get at the issue of jobs, housing balance, and also affordable housing. As far as just next steps go, to give the commission a sense of where to next, obviously the meeting tonight is to hear comments both from the public and the commission, and to bring those forward ultimately, and we're going to, from a timing standpoint, we have to hear back from the state by May 1st. That is the end target date. So we will be getting comments back from them. We have scheduled the housing element to come back to the Planning Commission on May 5th. It's our intent to notice that hearing, and with the assumption that we'll be able to address the comments that we get from the state on May 1st. It may turn out that the comments are too extensive, but we don't know that yet. So we're going to presume that the comments are manageable, and so the next time the commission will see this, assuming the commission does not want to continue the study session, would be on May 5th, and that would be for formal recommendation on the housing element. And then City Council is scheduled on May 26th to act on the housing element. Christina O'Rourke, the city's very able consultant, is in attendance here to answer any questions. And as a last item, as the commission is aware, there's something known as the Calderon Settlement Agreement, which is an agreement that the city, along with some affordable housing proponents, agreed to. And the terms of that agreement and the implications of that agreement definitely have overlap and relevance to the housing element. So we thought it would be valuable to go over that. There are copies of the Calderon agreement on the dais for the commission. I believe there's extra copies also in the back. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Aaron to summarize kind of the key contents and provisions of the Calderon agreement.
Sure. This is just a brief overview. The agreement's pretty extensive and detailed. As described in the housing element, St. Helena received RHNA a number of 31 total units distributed across very low income 8 units, low income 5 units, moderate income 5 units, and above moderate income 13 units. As part of the settlement agreement and the Calderon lawsuit, milepost deadlines for the approval of 30 affordable housing units by the year 2022 have been created. These units must be extremely low, very low, or lower income units. If the city does not approve the development of the cumulative number of affordable housing units, 30 total, by these deadlines, the city is required to deposit significant sums of money, up to $2.2 million, into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
So, in summary, that's the end of the staff presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions, and then presumably we would hear from the public and the commission.
All right, perfect. The microphones are very intense. Would you like to come up and give us a little deadline overview of the deadlines coming up, or no. Oh. I think we're okay. Okay. I'd like to open up the public comment unless commissioners have questions. All right.
I've got a couple questions.
You do? Okay. Go ahead.
Is this document that I have here what went to the state?
The document that's dated February 24th is what went to the state.
That's the one I picked up that you
Yes,
gave me?
yes.
Okay. So that went to the state.
Correct.
I would also like to know whether this general plan is, the housing element, is this a legal document or is this a roadmap?
Well, it's both. That's kind of weaselly way to respond, maybe. But it is a legal document. But general plans, by their nature, tend to have, policy language and goal language. Although housing elements are a bit more detailed and specific. But it really is both.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions for staff?
I do have a question. I guess it's kind of gets at the overlap between the Calderon settlement and the housing element, because some of the public comment we've received and some of the correspondence we've received is a cautionary, a little bit being cautious of committing language that says we will build or we will meet certain goals. Yet what I'm reading in the Calderon settlement, that's exactly in fact what the settlement says. So pulling them out of the housing, pulling that language out of the housing element doesn't supersede what we're going to be required to do legally anyway. So leaving it in the housing element seems to be just fine. Okay.
Now, Tracy's given me is the numbers in the Calderon settlement included in the housing element, or is this above and beyond?
They're above and beyond.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Just to clarify, so the numbers that are done for Calderon will count for the housing element, but the Calderon numbers are both over and above. The numbers are greater than those in the housing element, and some of the requirements, there's, I believe, some more stipulations in there.
Thank you.
And Victor, can you clarify how they're over and above? Because my understanding was they're different the way they sort across the categories, but the cumulative total is 31 in the housing element and 30 here, correct? Am I reading that?
Yeah, I believe that's maybe more of a coincidence than anything. The numbers, the RHNA numbers in the housing element for low and very low are the ones that are comparable to the Calderon agreement. I think the total for low and very low, Aaron, do you have?
13.
Or 13. And so the Calderon agreement, as you indicated, is up around 30. So what the Calderon agreement kind of in summary does is greatly increase the kind of the low end demand requirement for housing without really addressing the other number. One other thing worth noting is that the Calderon agreement specifically is worded so that second units do not count in terms of meeting its requirements.
I guess I have a question. Is the okay? Where are the funds? Are the funds in the affordable housing fund? You know, the ones that are to get from in lieu payments and so forth. Does that go toward this 2.2? Does that go towards the amount of money that we need to pay if we don't build the housing? Where would the money come from if we decided, if the housing isn't built and money were to?
No, the housing that's already set aside can't be used to account for this. That money will be new money out of the general fund.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, any other questions before we open up public comment? Okay, I'd like to open up public comment and invite people to come up.
Good evening, I'm Chuck Vondra. I live here in St. Helena. I was unable to find on the website the February 24th or 17th document. I found a bunch of stuff from last year, a year ago, a year and a half ago, so either I'm poor at searching the web or it's not evident or it's not there, but we're all talking about something that I've never seen, and if I haven't seen it, I'm guessing many people haven't seen it, so I don't know what the procedure is, but it'd be nice if that stuff was easy to find. There is something called Housing Element. Click here for more information. That'd be a very handy place to store documents like this latest update. What I did have a chance to review, and I think each of you may have reviewed it, is a letter that was written to the commission, to the city council, and staff from George David, who had somehow he got a hold of the document. He must have known the secret tunnel to how to get there. But I read his letter, and I assume that you have, and I think he brings up some very good points. George has been in real estate for years and years and years. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it tonight. But I thought I would come down and just talk about several things that he referenced in his letter that I think are very important. And one of them is something that Commissioner Sweeney just mentioned. It has to do with language in the housing element that I think doesn't serve well for the city of St. Helena. And specifically, he refers to the word that we're going to insure something, which also means to guarantee something. And in spite of the fact there's a separate agreement with the Calderon that the courts have worked out, and I understand that has its own feet and weight and merit, but I have never heard of a city ensuring or guaranteeing that it can do something which it doesn't really have the overall capacity to deliver on all these things. Cities don't have a lot of money. There's a lot of variables and factors in play. So what George had suggested, and I would second that, is that and I'm not sure how that language got into this document. I was under the impression it got taken out and then it got put back in. So I'm curious to know, why is that language in the document? If a legal agreement has its own legal teeth, then let that legal agreement stand on its own and do what it's intended to do. Legal agreements can change. Things can be appealed. I would strongly encourage you to look at this housing element and think of the potential liability of future lawsuits. My thinking is most of the people in this town, not all, but most of them are not in favor of us being sued by people. Some are, most of us aren't. So I would not like to see the city put a target on its back and invite lawsuits. And some lawsuits are meritorious. I won't disagree with that. I've mentioned at an earlier meeting, I work with a lot of cities through California, and I'm constantly hearing how they feel like they get targeted by people that know they can easily sue them, get legal fees. So why should we put a target on our back and make it easier? There's two concerns I have with guaranteeing that we can do something that we don't have 100% control over. One is lawsuits. Secondly is we could find ourselves in a situation where we are forced to build something that nobody in this town wants. A developer could say, wait a minute, you've guaranteed something. So it has nothing to do per se with the Calderon agreement. We might be able to meet some of the aspects of the Calderon agreement, but let's not let a developer use these words against us and say, because you're guaranteed something, I get to put a 20-story building in Main Street, or I get to do something. So I may be being a little bit of an exaggeration there, but I guess my point is there's lots of challenges and risk that the city doesn't need to take. What would our attorney say to the words guarantee? I'd be interested to look at Calistoga's housing element, American Canyon's housing element, Napa's housing element. We've done better at building affordable housing than many of those communities. We got sued, they didn't. I'm not sure the deal there, but the point is, do they guarantee things? Is this standard? Do cities guarantee this kind of thing? I would like the Planning Commission and whomever to strongly to take that under consideration. The second point Mr. David makes, again, which I think is a very good point, is there's a lot of concessions that we're offering developers. And I will state this, that I'm a believer in the need that this community has for affordable housing. I may have my own opinions on what the smartest and best way to do that is, but I want to stand here and say that I recognize it as a huge need for this city and something I've worked for and will continue to work on, trying to find creative solutions. But Mr. David's point there is that we're listing maybe 10 or 11 concessions, giveaways, freebies for developers. And his point is, what if someone said, great, I'll take them all, give them all to me. We may end up with something that's inconsistent with other elements of the housing element that says things should fit in. We might not want a 4-story building next to a 1-story building. We might not want certain things. So his point was maybe some caveats in there that these issues will be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I think the city will always have the ability to take a specific proposed development and make exceptions. Why just give it all away right at the outset and say, the door's open, come on in, we're giving everything away. If you want it all, take it all, carte blanche, no questions asked. His contention and mine would be a little bit tighter there and offer to look at things on a case-by-case basis. Let's not grant any potential future development anything it wants without understanding its impact. We're considering a development now that doesn't even show height and width. It just shows a map. And I'm thinking, how are we ever going to understand what this development's about? All it's showing is a two-dimensional plot map. So it's hard to make decisions when we don't know what the specifics of these proposed developments are going to be. I think a final point that I'll make, and I'm not sure what the procedure here is, that, you know, whether or not you get one shot at talking and then you have to go home or sit down, or whether we can come back if this is more of an interactive thing. My other, I guess, concern is that I heard mention here a few minutes ago that there's going to be a general plan workshop meeting in a week or before the next meeting. And I've heard rumors about that. But again, I scoured the website. There's nothing on the calendar. I've heard a rumor it's going to be an all-day Wednesday thing, which precludes a lot of working people. So I would like to request and plead with the city to put some more notice out there. If there's something next week and nobody knows about it, we're not going to get a lot of attendance. And I don't think that's the goal, is to shut people out of these discussions. So I would like to see more advanced notification. Even this meeting wasn't on the calendar as of a week ago, wasn't on the website. I did get a card in the mail, and thank you for that. So anyway, thanks for the time you're giving me. Again, my point is, let's strive to do things. We're obviously got some teeth. We're going to build this stuff. We've got projects in the works. But let's not guarantee things that we don't have to and that expose the city to unnecessary risk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sandy Erickson, Scott Street. It would take a lot more than my 3 minutes to correct Mr. Vondra's misinformation. So I'll get on to my point here. And that is that we have a new phenomenon in demographically speaking in St. Helena, and that is the growing amounts of people that are age 55 to 75. And St. Helena leads the county in older people, and 1,076 of them own their home, 421 of them rent. They comprise 1,497 householders, out of a total of 2,000. So they comprise over half the householders in St. Helena, and they're most likely to be spending over half of their income on housing. They are the largest percentage of voters in any election. They are most likely to have transportation and safety problems, forcing them to spend disproportionate amounts of diminishing income on local high prices, for which we're famous, by the way. And their income, disability, and quality of life are the last to be considered in planning for housing needs, livable accessibility to downtown, walkable, or consistent standard of living. They're the most likely to not say anything and make do. They're mostly women. St. Helena is currently forcing them to spend their money on a roof, not on their own well-being or their future income and maintenance needs. And St. Helena is increasingly punishing them for being old, for having bought a house here a long time ago, financially penalizing them, and ultimately forcing poverty upon them as they age. Silent poverty, by the way. So the other issue, all of these are statistically available in the very housing element from April 2014. Now, what happens is that all these people, mostly women, stay in their houses and they age in place. That house, that voter, is not going to vote to support any city tax or assessment increases, bonds, things like that require voter approval, because they can't. They do not want their taxes to go increase, even when they believe in the cause. They can't really sell because they can't buy anything here, and they can't pay the property taxes if they could buy something here. So, and have anything left over to provide what the greater increase in their housing would have cost them. So this is the group that needs the affordable housing the most. And the Hunter property and the Adams Street properties, particularly the Adams Street property, as was defined in the vision for Adams Street, should have elderly housing in it so that those people can walk to the post office, they can walk to a market, they are not trapped in their homes on the outer skirts of town, and they can be viable participating people. In the meantime, their properties, which would then turn over and would bring in newer people, higher earners, who would have much more financial ability to support city initiatives. So basically what's happening here is as the city ages, the city gets poorer. They are the most voters, and they are the least able to support city initiatives. So this is a unintended consequence. It affects mostly women, all nice, polite ladies. I can name at least 6 or 8 that I personally know that are holding on to their properties, and soon I'll be in the same boat. So I think that this has to be addressed. It's a uniquely identifiable problem. It has a direct impact on city income, and it must be solved. And the city owns the Adams Street property, and it should be used for that purpose, at least partially.
Thank you, Ms. Erickson.
Good evening. I'm Mary Stevenson. I live on Shipley Court, and I'm representing Our Town St. Helena, the local nonprofit housing advocacy group. Just briefly, I want to comment on the changes that were made on the needs assessment and the housing element. I still have a problem with us saying that the city estimates that 4 out of 10 second units are being rented when we only had 13 second units in the survey. We do not have sufficient data to support that comment, and I question it again. I also question the information about Craigslist saying that we have market rent second units available for low income. I check Craigslist every week. I have never seen more than 4 rentals on Craigslist at one time. So we're not talking about availability here. We're talking about a couple of listings on Craigslist. So these numbers are too small to support saying that we have this in our town. I also question the, let's see, what else did I question here? I also question the goals, policies, and the action plan, because there's no plan. There's a lot of goals, but there's no actual information on how we're going to do this. And I think we have a real opportunity to actually make something happen now. And we can do that without guaranteeing anything, and we can do it without market rate developers building 20-story buildings on Main Street. I mean, if you look at ABAG data, which is in the housing element, we're expecting a growth of 100 people between 2015 and 2025. That's 1.6% growth in the population. And we're expecting 60 households, which is 2.4 increase in households. So we're not talking about flooding St. Helena with new people here. We're talking about providing housing for the people who work in St. Helena. Coldwell Banker just came out with their latest housing report, and they said the average sale price for a house in St. Helena, in the city of St. Helena for March, was $1,410,731. We know from census that the median income is just under $80,000. These numbers do not compute. They haven't computed for years, and we have to start taking action on this. And in the last 17 years, we have built 3 deed-restricted houses and 16 rental units for low-income people. Now, you can say all this garbage in here, not garbage, all this supposed data in here that said we met our RHNA, but we only built a total of 19 units that were actually deed restricted or income qualified in the last 17 units. So, I mean, it's time for us to really set some goals here, and this housing element could be an opportunity to do that. I'd like to see the city set a goal of reducing the employee ratio by 25%. So instead of 78% of the people commuting into St. Helena, let's make it 50%. Can I continue for another minute?
Oh, of course.
We could do that by, these are things that I think we could set goals for and do this over the next two housing elements. Let's maintain 5% of our future St. Helena house sales as affordable for local people. There's 80 homes sold in St. Helena a year. Let's find a way to buy 4 homes a year and deed restrict them. That would give us a total over 20 years of 80 existing houses that would remain workforce housing. Let's convert at least 20% of the existing multi-unit market rate apartments to income qualified affordable units. That would mean we'd take 100 units over the next 20 years and make them income qualified the same way that Stonebridge and Hunts Grove are. That would give us 100 existing apartments that would remain affordable to workforce, because our existing apartments are going to skyrocket in price because there's no other rentals in St. Helena. They've gone up significantly in the last few years. Let's build at least 40 single-family dwellings for first-time home buyers. That would give us 40 new homeowners in St. Helena, most of who would come from existing rentals within the St. Helena area. Let's build 1 or more multi-unit apartments, and they don't have to be 4 stories or 20 stories, complexes that contain 60 units of very low and low-income rentals for families. So if we did this, if we set these goals, and the city doesn't have to pay for all this, the city has to be willing to have the political will to say we want to do this, and we could do that within this housing element, then we would have a total of 280 workforce housing units in 20 years. That would be amazing. And that would represent an 88% increase over our current affordable housing units. And this way we would be able to keep a diverse group of people in St. Helena. And this is the goals that you've got in the housing element. You've got the goals of maintaining a diverse housing group in St. Helena. I can't find a paper, but you know what the goals are. But there's nothing to back it up. So let's put some quantified goals in there and you know, do something audacious. Do something like the Ag Preserve, like the bike trail, you know, like Clinical Lay. Let's be a star at providing a diverse housing environment in St. Helena. If we did that, that would maintain our small town character better than anything else we could do. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment and invite Commissioner discussion.
I'll start. First of all, I'd like to agree with Mr. Vonda that I don't think this housing element has been vetted by the community. I'm very disturbed about that. We're supposed to be trying to show transparency, and in order to meet a deadline, it just seems like they're shoving it they're shoving it through, and I don't think that's right. And I would rather have to do a housing element every 4 minutes or 4 years and do it correctly than I would shove it through to meet a deadline. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel about it, so that's what I have to say. I also agree with what Mrs. Stevenson says, including the statistics on the second units with a very small sample. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that the City Council also said the same thing when I sat back there in the back and listened to them. Mr. Vonder, I also didn't know about a general plan meeting until tonight, next week. So I don't think they're just picking on you. I don't know why, but I don't think they're just picking on you. And I also think that we should put the Adams Street property and the Hunter property back as opportunity sites. That doesn't mean we have to build on them. That means we need to figure out what we're going to do with these properties. And I don't know why they were pulled. And they've been there ever since the 1973 general plan, because I went back and looked at that. I didn't bring it with me tonight, but I have it at home if anybody'd like to see it. And I think that we need to put that back until we decide what we're going to do with those properties. That's all the comments I think I have.
Thank you, Grace.
I'd like to agree with Grace on a couple of those points. In particular, the Adams Street property and the Hunter's property, why they were taken off, and the fact that we have brought up putting them back on. They should be on. I don't know how that works with the timeline with the state, but nonetheless, I'd like to be on the record. In terms of the second units, I also want to voice my concern that we are using such a small universe for our data. And I think if you drill into it further, if I read and understood it correctly, that even of the 4 units of the 10 that they talked about being able to find some data on, that even within those, only 1 out of those 4 was truly at an affordable rate. It wasn't the other for market rate. So we're talking about 1 out of 10 of a very small group anyway. So we're really kind of dancing around with numbers that aren't real. I was under the impression tonight we were going to speak a little bit to second units and talking about incentives and other things, so maybe we'll bring that up more when we come back to that. But that is something that we're putting a lot of weight and credence on something that really isn't getting done what we need to get done. And I do want to agree with Ms. Stevenson about setting some specific goals with the caveat and the caution, I believe, that I share with Mr. Vondra as well as other citizens that I've spoken with, that we kind of get ourselves into situations where we're taking on risk that we cannot afford. And certainly in the weeks since we've started these conversations on the housing element draft, we've been exposed and learned quite a bit more about our city's financial situation. So I think it's even more important that we're cautious. So although I want to see some teeth, I am very concerned that in addition to what we're faced with the Calderon settlement, to add even more on top of that ourselves to the housing element, although I think it's an important thing to be looking at, I think we're in a situation where we really could be putting ourselves at risk. So that would be something I'd be cautious of in terms of our language that we use. The rest I think we'll kind of come back to as we speak to, but that was kind of the main points I had.
Well, I have several main points, but I want to agree with Commissioner Sweeney and Kisner regarding this survey too. I was hoping that we could get a new survey. I know I have a second unit, and several friends of mine have second units, and we weren't called. So I certainly don't think it's the only solution to affordable housing, but I think it's one of the components. And I was talking to some people today in Piedmont and Berkeley about what they're doing, and I think I'm very excited about the possibility, especially for seniors and others, to continue to support that program, not as the only approach, but I think there are really positive ways to do it. I don't think there should be specific numbers in the housing element. I don't think it's appropriate, and for the reasons you were stating. And I also think that 200 or 400 affordable units that cannot be guaranteed to serve local workers would not necessarily not affect the small town character of St. Helena, because to me that says 800 cars right there. But that's just a comment from someone tonight. I had some other things that were in response to Mr. David's letter as well. Shall I go through them?
Absolutely.
Okay, and to my own concerns. So, okay, on page 4 of the housing element, under the non-governmental and governmental constraints, he had mentioned, and I wanted you guys to ask if you guys agreed, he had mentioned that the first sentence, second line, he suggested deleting the availability of financing with the tightening of national credit market, because he is very much involved in the industry. He felt that was no longer correct. And I don't know what staff feels, and I don't know what you guys feel about that, but I thought that was definitely worth
I would disagree with that. I think we're still in an environment where lenders are much more cautious, and I think some of the challenges that we've seen in projects that have come through is they don't pencil. So although it may not be the term tightening of credit markets, may be itself something that we want to look at and maybe kind of change the the way that's phrased, I think to say that we're not in a situation where lenders are cautious is not true. And I would be
Well,
more
it doesn't
comfortable
pencil out many times because of the high cost of land here, not because of the lending. Well, I'm not an expert, but he is, and so I thought that maybe we should address that. Anyone else sounds like you don't agree with that, but.
I'm in agreement with Ms. Sweeney with that. I think that lenders are definitely still very cautious about projects and the need to pencil out.
Okay, then on page 6, the goal 4, to assist, page 6 in the housing element.
Oh, I thought you were talking about Mr. Davis.
Oh, no, sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, okay, on goal 4, assistance to support affordable housing, I was wanting to add, and these are some of his words, but enlist the support and cooperation of retail and service businesses, hotels, hospitality, and winery vineyard operations to explore ways that they can contribute to the actual building of affordable housing, including on-site construction when possible. I thought that would be innovative and effective and appropriate to add that to the housing element. And I don't know what you guys think of that. I mean, I think it's a really good idea. We've talked about it. It's been talked about at the city council meetings as well, how the local industries who are employing people and expanding their businesses and making profit, expanding their businesses and employing people could contribute more to, particularly not necessarily in lieu payments, but could actually build some housing, and that we could change whatever zoning problems there might be for constructing affordable housing on particularly ag land where the wineries are, where there are temporary facilities, but perhaps could be full-time family for low affordable people. So is there any, do you guys
Can I ask a question? Are you saying in addition to what some of the incentives and opportunities for the developers as far as changing zoning, that's one piece, but you also want to require,
I wanted to add that language.
but you also want to require wineries?
No, not require. I just enlist and support the cooperation of retail services and business. It's certainly not, couldn't possibly do that, But I just thought it was something we could have in there to show that that's the direction we're going in, where we'd like to work cooperatively. I mean, so I'm not the first person to say it. It's being said by the coalition that Mr. Ellsworth talked about, how can we begin to work, as our resources go down and as our things are saturated, how can we all begin to work more cooperatively together? And I thought that might be a good thing to put in our housing element, to introduce that in a guidepost way, not it's not a law or anything, but.
So would you propose to give incentives for doing that?
Well, sure. Incentives, oh, absolutely, and there'd have to be zoning changes, and there might be, but, we could just start to explore it. I think it's important to have it in our housing element. I think it's forward-looking and, and appropriate. I think it's a direction we're going in anyway.
I feel like I would need more time more information than just Mr. David's letter and a goal to really put, I think that we should have more of a discussion on that than just, so how about you keep going, and I'll make a note of that to bring that back, but.
Okay. And goal 5, let's see, also on page 6. And I numbered the goals because they aren't goals. They're not numbered. But this one is resource conservation. And we could add, support the city to conduct an impact study. I thought this was a really good suggestion. Support the city to conduct an impact study to determine the actual net cost to the city of St. Helena of providing services for new developments of any kind. I think that's a prudent and necessary thing that we should be doing anyway. I think we should do a cost, I don't. In the city, does the city automatically do that when you're first talking to people, or?
Well, we do in a staff report include a section of fiscal impacts, so we do look in a general sense at that question. I think it's safe to say that strictly on a tax basis, you know, in terms of the amount of taxes that are received from a project and the cost of providing services, my guess is most, if not all, of affordable housing projects end up being a net loss to the city. So I think, you know, the whole idea of having a diverse housing stock and the benefits that bring to the community are significant. But I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with talking about a full-on fiscal analysis of housing, which, particularly affordable housing, which is inherently fiscally challenged, I guess, and at least analyses I've seen, although obviously housing values are so high in this community that probably straight market rate housing is a net plus, but anything that's at all affordable, and then if you throw in the fact that it may be covered by a nonprofit, which a lot of ways can take it off the tax rolls, you would end up be triggering this whole raft of negative numbers. I think it would be better just perhaps not to trigger studies, but I think the community or commission and council understand that these are not profit centers in terms of from a tax standpoint, or would have a net tax benefit to the city. They have other benefits, but they're not tax benefits.
I don't think that the benefits are really quantifiable. I think that they're more...
Well, I'm not suggesting that there's any requirement that there needs to be a positive result. I think it's important for the city.
I just don't think that's...
the public, let me finish, for the city and the public simply to know what it is. And if we can know what that number is, that will help us determine in lieu fees, perhaps. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't do something if there's a negative...
I don't think that you're going to get what you're asking for by the study that you're bringing up, is I think what I'm getting at. I don't think that it's going to be such a negative number for the low-income housing that it's not going to have... I think a different type of study would give the results and the information to the city that you're asking for. I just don't think your study specifically is going to be the one that gives that information. Because I don't think you're going to get it from taxes.
I didn't say taxes. I didn't even talk about taxes. I have no idea. I'm not.
Say
Bobby.
what you're talking about, Bobby.
I'm assuming, that an impact study, I don't know what that is, but you've kind of given a sense of what that is.
Well, yeah, I mean, a fiscal impact study, as I'm used to looking at them, are done from a city perspective and look at the net cost of the city providing services to a given development, and then that is offset by the revenue from that development. And that's what a typical fiscal impact study, from a city perspective at least, would look at. Obviously, if someone is trying to put together an affordable housing project, then they're, trying to, and that's where the challenge is, coming up with enough money to provide the needed subsidy. But getting back to the point is, Chair Parker indicates that any analysis you do of any sort of affordable project is going to be inherently negative, and so I guess I'm not sure what that's gaining you, other than maybe providing opponents with perhaps sort of built-in...
No, that's not what I'm thinking at all.
Okay.
What it does is provide information. It provides information so we know exactly where we need to make something up, or if we have how much money we need to support the affordable housing. I'm not saying that we would use this to deny developments if it were negative. That's not what I'm talking about at all. This is for information. I don't think we have that information now. I think everyone needs to have it so we know what we're dealing with when we approach projects. And the ones that will pay well, it's great because they can then compensate for the ones that can't pay well. I'm not at all trying to set up some way.
Okay, I just think that the report that you stated is not the right report to gather the information that you're asking for. I think the information that you're asking for is absolutely information that should be gathered. I just think that the report that you initially said was...
Okay,
wasn't...
I don't remember saying a report. Okay, how about some kind of report then that support the city to conduct it was referred to as an impact study, whatever you want to call it, to determine the actual net cost so that we have that for information. I can see that, that there's a lot of resistance here. So, that's just something I was interested in.
Commissioner Minute, are you trying to align with with Mr. Davis' letter? Is that what you're trying, I'm just trying to understand what you're.
I am addressing some of the things that he mentioned were already concerns of mine.
Okay.
And so I'm addressing my concerns as well as the things that he mentioned in the letter. Some of them that were identical. So that's all. And I can use, you can use whatever.
So do you want to like have like a population study with, the impacts socially, social impacts,
No,
or?
the fiscal impact, the economic impact on all of them, to show, some of them will be a great boon in terms of, some of them, like the hotel, would be, the analysis there would be very much in the profit side. And analysis, I wasn't even thinking of affordable housing when I was thinking about it. I just thought all projects, we should know that. We should have.
For maybe, would it make sense to kind of stick to just the housing element?
Yeah,
Right.
can we kind of bring it back
It'd be
in?
helpful, just make it easier for us to follow
then
along.
forget
a
that
little
one.
I'm not sure some of this shouldn't be just in a staff report,
Yeah.
rather than,
I also think we're bordering that Brown Act violation, because I don't think that was really agendized to discuss development things. So if we could get back on.
Well, these are okay. So page 8, goal 1, I'm wondering, okay, this is the insure word thing. So I'm getting the sense that you guys, what about changing to assure instead of ensure, or are you guys okay with the way it is?
I have it as assure.
Oh, really? Because it's ensure in the housing element.
Yeah, no, I think
I thought
that's
we were
something.
changing
My copy says assure.
Really? What is it? Because mine says ensure.
Ours is insure.
On page 6, equal housing
On
opportunities?
Page 8, goal 1, HE 1.1.
It's the building.
Oh.
And
It's-
HE
Oh, yeah,
1.3.
insure.
Yeah.
And
So-
I think that was a valid discussion point, is perhaps looking for words like endeavor to, or.
Assure. I mean, assure would be fine. It doesn't mean guarantee. It's a different meaning, and it would be for people who were, So would that be something you'd be?
That's on my list of things, is just do a little Control F search through the Word document or PDF and just find all the insurers and,
Change them to assure?
let me put it this way, Bobby, I agree with you if you're looking at H213, but I don't agree with you if you're talking about H211. And I
Okay.
think it depends on what you're discussing. H211 says, ensure that the general plan's growth management policies do not limit our ability to meet housing needs.
Okay, so we could leave
So
that
I
one.
think that one's okay.
Okay.
But if you look at number 3,
Yeah.
where it's ensuring that we're gonna build affordable housing, then I agree with you. So
Okay.
I
So
I
can
think you have to look
we
at
change those?
what we're talking about and not just pick on a specific word.
You're right.
I think it needs to be just when it's used in a context that creates a vulnerability to lawsuits in case things don't happen, and also puts a reliance on the city to force things to happen that are somewhat out of the city's scope and ability.
So could we
Like I
change,
was saying with the growth management system, I mean, that's a city.
Yeah, that is a city controlled.
That's correct.
Yeah, if it's city controlled, then I don't have as much of a problem with it. But if it's something that's outside the city's sphere, then I would like the words to be.
I like the places where they change some of the words to promote.
okay, so how about we can change the HE 1.3? That's the one that you just mentioned that you were okay with. And then on page 12, HE 2.2. How about, I would like to see that assure as opposed to ensure, but you guys would be okay with that
Or
one?
promote. I actually,
Promote?
yeah.
Great. Maybe that could be changed to promote. That's HE 2.2.
I believe.
It was not in this one. This one's the updated one. I want yours. I did.
It's like the general plan update when we had 5 different versions.
Yeah, we should, yeah.
There's still 2 out.
Page
It's
12.
Yeah, I thought it's.
We don't know which one is which.
Policy.
On page 12, it's going to be promote, promote higher density housing opportunities.
Says
Yeah,
promote.
promote is wrong.
That's
It would
fine.
have to be assure, maybe?
Assure that higher density housing opportunity sites are not lost to
I don't
lower
know.
density
You guys
uses.
okay with that? As opposed to ensure?
Well, I just would leave ensure alone there.
Well, I think the point that
I don't
was,
think that's gonna get, I don't think
Right, I
that,
agree with Grace.
I don't
Yeah.
think that's gonna get us sued.
no, it's not going to get us sued, but it may.
The only place I
it
was
may
concerned was
interfere
literally
with-
on the numbers, when it was tied to
I agree.
completion.
Yeah, and I was only really concerned with things that, like, it's a guarantee that the city is going to have this happen, but the city doesn't have control over being able to guarantee it.
Right,
I believe that's the only place that really is a strong problem, is
Yeah.
where
What
it's
about
tied
the
to
numbers?
What about the point that Mr. David made that may make it difficult to downzone if we decide to downzone in certain areas? I mean, that seemed like a reason why have insure when an assure would make it, would not be, would make it easier to make changes.
Could I ask the staff to clarify that? Because my understanding on the zoning is that we already have language to the effect that we will not have zoning in place that creates any barriers. So that's kind of already sitting there. So
No, if we
we're
want to
sort of
change zoning.
but we've already
Well, I don't
made
know.
a
Maybe
statement
it
that says
wouldn't
we'll
interfere.
always
What's
work
your
towards having zoning that supports housing.
First of all, these are the higher density sites, so these are going to be your multi-density sites, and you're not,
The west
you're going
side
to be.
of town is multi-family right
Yeah,
now.
there's just a few of the sites in the housing element, and
But the zoning.
and so but there's a pretty wide range on those density sites as it is, and
Actually, I think there is a real point here in the sense that the city has the medium density zone that has a very high density, very unusually high density range, and most of the city's single family housing is within that zone, and the range goes from, I believe it's 6 to 16.
16.1,
units an acre. Maybe what we could simply do is clarify when we're talking about higher density that we're talking about, we put a number in there and indicate that that's the high density zone as opposed to higher. Higher is kind of an odd number to use. So that would apply to the city's high density category. We could even put aside a number such as 20 units an acre, which typically is a number, and Christine could correct me if I'm wrong, but that HCD finds as an important number, kind of that's their benchmark for high density. But as I look at this and think about it, if somebody looked at the city's medium density zone, and I think there's an issue that the city needs to look at coming up with a lower overall upper limit on that perhaps this could be used against the city. So, I mean, I see some merit. Insure is fine, but I think it needs to be clear that that's for the high density zoning designation.
Well, I have a question on that then, Victor, because there are places on the east side of town that are zoned high density that are mostly single family dwellings. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the rezoning, when we do get to that we will want to downzone some of that. Because, it goes up to 24 per acre. And
I think that you'll do that in the codes.
Well, I'm just simply saying that it might be important to. I don't know if you can mention that if you want, but I still think insure might get in the way if those high density places, and there are a lot of them in single family neighborhoods, might want to zone down. So. So does it make sense to you guys to say assure there instead of insure?
No.
I'm actually fine with it the way it is.
Okay. So then the next one is, on page 9, on HE1F, and I thought we had already done this, but let's see, where is it? No, wait a minute, page 9. HE1F, that's not on page 9. Yeah, it is. Oh, over here, yeah. It said, I had talked about this. When work with private property owners and developers to plan for road and utility improvements necessary to support housing on key opportunity sites. In the event that these sites are developed, funding shall be done on a fair share proportion of the costs. I remember a conversation that was had in that city council meeting a couple of years ago, that there might be times when we would want to ask the developer to take the full cost that we would not want to share. I'm wondering, does this language shall mean that we always have to, or would we still have the option to ask the developer to do the entire, all those improvements?
And Victor, can you clarify? I thought that was also one that was being replaced with the word may.
So did I.
I mean, it's in our notes as well as to discuss for tonight.
this was something that you had brought up at the
I did,
planning commission
yes,
meeting,
yeah.
and we did bring that proposed change to the council, and the council settled on the language that's in here.
They want
So
shall,
there
will.
was a discussion about it, and I can't remember exactly
Can I
how
bring
that-
it up again?
how that transpired, but
I'm appealing. I don't know, is that possible for me to ask?
Yeah,
again?
I mean, just to clarify, what we're getting here is direction from the commission, and with comments from the public through the commission. This is going to end up next at the planning commission in the first meeting in May. That's the way it's currently scheduled. So any changes that you would like to see, the commission would like to see, we will incorporate into the version that we bring to you. And if it differs from what council did, then presumably council could change it back if they
Okay.
wanted.
Is that okay with the rest of you to change that to May?
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, great. Okay. On page 10, in keeping with concerns about relaxing development standards resulting in substandard housing for the poor, which is a big concern of mine, let us add to the fourth sentence, line down, relaxing site development standards and insert that will not result in substandard housing. End of insert, and then go on. Just to insert that won't result in substandard housing. I just would
Which housing element number is this?
This
On
is
page 10.
wait a minute. Where am I?
It was one of the goals, HE1.1. And again, it's
Yeah, it's a standard for the poor. It's the sixth line down. It's this fourth sentence, sixth line down.
From the notes and the recap, my understanding was we as a group, and then it sounds like it didn't happen at council, but that we were just going to strike relax site development
That's what I thought,
standards,
too,
but
but
not
it's not.
replace it with something else, just literally take
Well, I
that.
thought if we left it in, well, that's what I thought, but it was left in, so I thought, oh, it's not going to be stricken. So I thought if we added that, that would take care of my concerns anyway. So either way, either strike it out or, yeah, thanks.
So this is another issue that you had brought up at the last meeting, and we did bring it forward to the council, and they chose not to make any changes to this. So the relaxing site developments are things like reducing the setbacks or increasing the height. So when you talk about substandard housing, I mean that's a term that would generally be used for housing that doesn't meet building codes. So and that would not be the case in relaxing development standards. We're not talking about allowing housing that has doesn't meet the minimum ceiling height, for example.
Okay, then I would.
I
see what
think
you're
that was probably why they decided to leave this the way it was.
Why couldn't we strike it?
To strike relaxing
Yes.
site development standards, because that's actually a real incentive that could be provided to.
Even if it produces the kind of housing that doesn't, that is overcrowded, and you're shaking your overcrowded, and it's
Well, the way it's written-
because those standards, mainly because I understand it's incentive, but those standards were made to establish civil living conditions for people. Isn't that why they were made? And when we take them away as an incentive, I would like to have other kinds of incentives to build affordable housing, not incentives that take away the civility of the standards that we have established for that civility. I think it's reverse discrimination. I find it really awful that density can go up because people
If I could add, what it does is allow for the possibility. The city still has discretionary authority. It doesn't mean that the city has to approve these things. I mean, the comment was made earlier about all these various exemptions and what if somebody comes in for all of them. The reality is there's state exemptions where the state has preempted a local authority, like on density bonuses and things that we have limited ability to say no on. But something like this, the city does have a development review process, and as part of that, we can decide if it's appropriate. If a development project, is and any affordable project in this community is incredibly challenged to be financially viable, i.e., to break even, that can be achieved by perhaps modifying a setback or a height limit. And as long as the city has discretionary control to make that decision, it just seems like it's a good possibility to leave open. It's not carte blanche to a developer and where he can do whatever he wants because they have to go through the city approval process.
Well, you also
It gives a tool.
The UBC, I mean, you know,
And we're not
you've got
talking.
building codes and stuff that are.
We're not as Christy mentioned. We're not talking about building codes here. This is just
That's correct.
zoning stuff. So
That's what you understand.
the intent is not to, get into UBC, which are basic public health safety things. On the zoning end, it gets a little softer and relates to, you'd have a hard time necessarily saying, a specific setback of 8 feet versus 10 feet is a public health, safety issue. So, in any case, the wording simply gives the city that discretion, and I think it's probably good to keep it in there. And then this is one that if we probably eliminated it, the state would say, why are you taking this out? And
Well, okay, I hear what you're
And could
saying.
I offer, I don't think our problem's been that we're building all of these dangerous substandard houses. Our problem's we're not building housing. So
Well,
the more, to put in language that makes it even more difficult to get a project built, I don't think is kind of against the genuine spirit of what we're trying to, I think, accomplish in this.
And to piggyback on that is that with these relaxing site development standards, it's the same as a case-by-case variance situation. It's not. We're not going to do it for every single one. It's if we, for the Pope Street housing that we had
That's what I'm
approved,
thinking.
if they wanted an extra 2 feet in height, we can,
driveway.
and a driveway, we can do that. We can, because they're relaxed to do that. I don't think that makes their housing substandard. I think it just makes it so that their cost, so that the cost to develop pencils out because they can add one extra unit, and then we can get the housing that we need. So I'm for keeping, relaxing, and.
Okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I still, I stick to my guns on, I understand it has to pencil out, but as a matter of fact, when you have a higher density, I'm not sure it fits in with the goal that says that whatever's been developments have to fit in with the existing neighborhoods and contribute to the overall livability of our community. That's one of the stated goals. I think having high density developments, doesn't, higher than is allowed by ordinances, without a variance, doesn't necessarily contribute to overall livability. But I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm not going to push for a change, but I'm wondering, is there any place in the housing element where those sentiments might be expressed except in the goals? Because the goals, to my mind, are not compatible with some of these. The goals on page 6 or whatever they are.
Unfortunately, Bobby, I think that you're asking is going against what this housing element and affordability is trying to
The
have.
housing element is not only about affordable housing. The housing element is about all housing in St. Helena. It's part of I'm not even speaking. That is not what's on my mind. I'm not trying to constrain the building of. That's not what's on my mind here. My mind is a sense of livability. My mind is these goals. I think these goals.
Well,
are
for
great.
this one actually is for workhouse housing, low income things. This one that you're talking about is low income housing. It's not housing goals in
I understand
general.
that. What I would like to see when that happens is I would like to see other ways of supporting that housing so that it could be built within the standards that people who have more money can build their housing. I don't want to see the housing not built, but I want to see it built in a way. And if it takes more money, then I wanted to, I would like to see a certain percentage of money from the city be set aside always for affordable housing on an ongoing basis. And, to cover some of the things so we could subsidize the developers to pencil out without compromising the well thought out civil code of our ordinances. That's all I'm saying. I'm just thinking
I believe that the city actually already does that, and so I think that I would like to move on from this topic, please. So if you could do your next, that would be great.
That's it.
All right.
So my last thing was: is there any way to include any kind of language supporting those goals other than where the goals are, or to say somewhere that is there any way to do that? Or?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. And there is a lot of there is language in here about preserving neighborhoods and making sure that that housing does fit in with the existing neighborhood and in the existing context. There is a lot of language in here.
So that should be sufficient to.
That's like,
And Bobby, and I know you feel strongly about this, I think that if you do this as a personal level to the city council, not from the planning commission, I think that would probably be a more appropriate action for your concerns with this section.
I am satisfied with what Christine just said in terms of, and also since we can use those caveats when we're dealing with individual developments, and if we feel that they don't meet those goals, we can question them on that basis. That's okay. So we don't have to have the language in these locations. So okay. So I'm okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
so I'd like to make one point about kind of where we are with HCD. So when we sent the draft to HCD, they should be contacting us actually within like the next week, because by week 5 in the process, we should have a conference call with HCD, and they'll bring up anything that they find that doesn't meet their state law or just their review requirements. For example, if they find that the second unit survey that we did was inadequate, they will mention that, and then we'll have to resolve that with them. So the element that's been sent to them at the end of this process, they'll bring up their comments, we'll propose to make revisions, and we'll kind of work that through with HCD. And then by May 1st, we should be getting a letter from them that says, with these revisions that staff has proposed, we agree, then the element we find that will meet statutory requirements. And then we can take that back and have that adopted bring it back to the Planning Commission for recommendation, and then bring it to the City Council for adoption. So at this point, since HCD is already reviewing the housing element, we don't want to make a lot of changes to the housing element, especially any changes that kind of reduce the effectiveness of the element. So if we're talking about making any changes that are housing element friendly, that would be fine, because we don't want to jeopardize our pre-approval that we're going to be getting. And we need to do that in order to make this deadline and have it adopted by May 31st.
Our little few word changes that we've made, are those?
So changing ensure to assure, I think, is fine. But I just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of, where we are in the process and kind of what the range we have here for making changes. And specifically, there were those 2 items that the council wanted us to discuss that we wanted to really make sure that we got feedback from the.
And that was the second unit's incentives.
And that was about what incentives might be appropriate for not just there's a lot of incentives that are here in the housing element for
second units, development and commercial.
But to either, do we want to tie those incentives to deed restrictions for second units, and maybe what that process would be. And then the other is what kind of incentives to provide for commercial projects that are going to provide on-site employee housing. Okay.
All right, thank you.
you.
Does anyone?
Can I ask a question on the
Sure.
on-site employee housing? Is that something that needs to be separated from the other incentives we have, or can we put those sweeteners in and tie them specifically to on-site employee housing? Because we've got a nice list of fast-tracking fee reductions, things like that apply to any developer, correct, regardless of what.
Right.
So
Exactly.
so can we then spell out specific sweeteners that are tied directly to on-site properties?
Yeah, and I think that was the intention, because of
Okay.
course those blanket ones like fast track processing and fee reductions are really for any affordable housing development.
It makes everything better. And if we're making it better rather than reducing things, it's not near as much trouble.
Right.
And I want to make a comment about the process. Because of the Brown Act, I can't talk to you guys, about this stuff. And this was really a place for me. I had a lot of concerns. It was a place for me to have the discussion. And I really am open to what you've said. So I know I was probably getting annoying because I do that. But I really appreciated the opportunity to have the discussion here, and particularly with staff and Christine here too. So I'm hoping that's okay to use this time for. That's what I thought it would be, because, it's a way to work it out.
You did it, so it's got to be okay.
What?
It's already been done, so it has to be okay.
But it's got to be okay.
I wanted to explain, that's how I came here with my concerns, and I really wanted to talk to you about it and hear what you had to say too.
Well, I'd like to hear what other people have to say about the incentives linked to commercial developments, and go over those things that City Council has asked for us to do, because we've really just talked about the verbiage and I would like to talk more about the attachment of on-site employee housing and other kind of incentives that we could have in regards to deed restriction in second units. And then I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I agree with my fellow commissioners on everything else.
Does staff have direction in that regard in terms of what other local communities are doing? Because we could just throw out ideas, but it seems it might be more productive to be looking at specifically.
I talked to Kate Black, who is the city planner of Piedmont today, and I also spoke with the Carol Johnson, who they're just doing something in Berkeley. I don't know if you guys saw that article in the paper a couple of weeks ago. They're doing second housing, and they have some, and they have some things that they shared with me, some things that they're doing. And so I think your idea is really good. We probably need more too, but this might be a start for. For instance, a person in Piedmont, if they want to do an accessory dwelling, they don't call a second unit. There's a distinction there. I don't know if there's a distinction here.
It's the same thing. It's just
they
just have a different name for it.
Yeah, well, they have one thing they call accessory dwelling, and the other thing they call second unit. So they make a distinction in their town. But for the accessory dwelling, like a person has to have off-street parking in order to build anything, but they'll let them. If they agree to have it deed restricted for 10 years, they will give them a modification on the parking requirement so that they can go and help. That's an example. And she had other examples too, but that's one thing they're doing.
Yeah, would you share them with us?
Oh, let's see. Okay. Well, that was one. Oh, you cannot rent, if you have two houses, you cannot rent both. You have to live in one. It's kind of like the old winery ordinance. You have to be in residence there.
You mean the current winery ordinance?
No, the current one. Yeah. You can't. You cannot. What was I going to say? Okay. The deed restriction goes there. You can't do short-term rental in the accessory dwelling. I'm sure we have some of these too. And they found they had 98% compliance with the very low income second units that they had. And it was very
to clarify, they do deed restrict.
Yes, they do.
Did she give any incentives that they did?
Because they're just one was
just the parking.
They couldn't. They won't be able to build it if they can't. Yeah, that was one. And the deed restriction that goes with the property. For one, it was 10 years, and then let's see. That's all I got from today. I just talked to him for a few minutes, but
I worked with Kate Black and with the city of Piedmont to develop that program with them many years ago, actually. And it's been very successful for them. They've been doing it for 2 housing element cycles. And what they did was they have 2 different tiers. So they're deed restricted, and they have a deed restriction for, and this is going back to the first iteration. I know they've made some changes to them. So it might be a little different. But the idea was that they were going to allow larger units than what I think it was a 750 or 700 square foot minimum. So you could get a larger unit if you deed restricted it for low income. And then they gave the very low, if you deed restricted for very low, then the incentive was this waiver of the parking spot. And the issue in Piedmont is that they have very, very restricted parking there. And they have a very high, very restrictive parking requirement. So they actually require a parking space for so many bedrooms. And so this particular incentive was something that they really needed. And you have to demonstrate that there is, or they have a way where they can not grant it if there's not any on-street parking that could accommodate that additional unit. So what they found is that that incentive is what was most valuable, and they basically satisfy all of their very low units through this program and deed restricting it. So in Ross, they also did another kind of similar program, exchanging deed restrictions, and that was for a 500 square area floor area ratio bonus.
Oh.
And they've gotten a few. They haven't had as much of a success with it as Piedmont did. The key to doing this kind of program is that you're really giving an incentive that's very valued by the community. So that's one thing to think about. The other is really just kind of mechanically, how do you implement this? Are you going to you're going to not only deed restricted, but you're going to have some kind of, and this doesn't need to be, decided now, but eventually you're going to want to think about, are you going to verify the income of the people who are in the unit? You're going to certainly verify the rent that's charged, but there are some, when you're crafting that ordinance, there's some other things that you're going to want to keep in mind. But so right now, one of the things that we had talked about is that the city does provide a 400 square foot floor area ratio bonus for second units.
We took that off last meeting.
We're in the.
Did you take that off?
Well, can we, because maybe it's a time to bring that up now, because we had, when we met,
we had taken that.
we
yeah.
took them off the exceptions, although they still have to, that still has to
Yeah,
happen.
it still has to go to
from
the city council.
We brought at a discussion point that we would eliminate these exceptions with the idea we'd circle back to the housing element and then tie them to the deed restriction.
That is
That we
correct.
felt the problem was we put them out there, we had all these second units built.
Yeah, there wasn't, the deed restriction wasn't attached to it, and so it was just kind of a free-for-all, and it's just a nice guest room rather than being a second unit, which is
So you
really
got
what
all
the
these second units, and then nobody wants to count
Yeah.
them.
But the idea was to come back tonight then and say,
exactly,
okay,
or to come back eventually once this was approved to really, because I don't think that we're going to be able to draft a second unit deed restriction thing for this housing element. I don't think that you want us to do that. I think that would be too much of a change for HDC to deal with at this point. But Victor's going maybe.
Well, I know that Kate also said for now, what they do is they send out a form every year checking the assets of the person renting and verifying the rent. So you'd have to, you'd have to be really you'd have to be lying.
Yeah, no, we're really more talking about like how we're going to incorporate the second units and deed restrictions back in. I just felt that I think we all felt that it wasn't so great as an exception to FAR, but needed to be in a separate section of this is where the exception lives. It lives under this heading, rather affordable housing, rather under zoning.
And I think we can include that in the housing element at this point. There is something about, tying, I think it was the workforce, I'd have to look up which program it is, to tying, development of workforce housing, or no, I think it was providing some kind of financial incentive.
Right, the
So-
waivers, the
so I
fee
think that-
waivers are usually.
well, it was to close the
like a fee
loophole that
waiver.
we
So I
sort of
think-
created. We knew it was motivating people to build to have those exceptions, but they weren't in fact then necessarily
There was no enforceability.
right using those units.
Right,
So-
and we can never actually ensure that the unit is being occupied. So that's something that you have to, that we can't force them to rent it. But you can verify that it is a very low income household that's living in it, and that they're charging the appropriate rent, no more than 30% of that income's household. So you can do that. So the question really is, if you want to do a deed restriction, it would be in exchange for what incentives? A FAR bonus, it can be a parking restriction, it can be for
Fee
The
waivers.
garage waiver.
Fee
I mean,
waivers.
Yeah.
Fee
incorporate the
waivers,
three
yeah.
we took out.
Big, yeah.
I think they're doing a lot of this right now in Windsor. If you want to start reading the Press Democrat, I've been reading it the last 2 or 3 weeks, and they're doing a lot of this right now over there. It's pretty interesting.
So what incentives do we want to give to city council?
I mean, I think it makes sense to look to just kind of reinstate or list what we just took out the exemptions. Because in my mind at that time, it was because it didn't make sense there. But those elements made sense, and they were motivating people. But we didn't have the teeth to then
To make them affordable.
make them
Do you
work
think
for
it
why
should-
they were created.
Do you think it should be more than 400 square feet? I mean, because 800 is actually, I think our ordinance allows 800 for
850.
850. So maybe it should reflect as long as it doesn't change the footprint of the house, like if it builds up. Oh, yeah, I don't know. Do you think it should be
Change
bigger
the
than
footprint.
400?
Excuse me?
I would look to
I
experts.
said it's going to change the footprint.
Well,
It's going to change the
yeah,
footprint.
it's going to change.
No doubt. it will.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you go up, you don't change you're not going to change the setbacks.
Yeah, but most second units are second units. They're not.
Or above a garage or something.
Yeah.
Well, and I think your question is 400 feet enough
Right.
to create the unit? But
To be an incentive. Is that something people really want?
I think so. In St. Helena, yeah, I think so.
You think we think we should make it bigger?
No.
From a staff standpoint, I think 400 is more than enough. I think the fact is that the housing prices are so high. It seems like most everyone we talk to seems to want to put a second unit in, and they look at that as a source of income. So the issue, and rightly, I think it makes sense to take off the exemption for just market rate and look at that tied to affordability. The other part of it, though, and I need to work with Christine because she's the expert at it, is to talk about the enforcement end, because in Piedmont or other places, based on getting it sounds like people kind of self-report. That's fine in some cases, but the reality is we're talking about, and that's why I don't want to make the number too big of a bonus, because we're talking about a significant financial incentive. And the other part of it is, as Christine just mentioned, the people could always decide
not to rent it. And then it's just a guest house.
And then it's a guest house, but they've got the ability to put more on the site than anybody else would, because they had committed at one point. They have it deed restricted. They're just not happen. They just have decided not to rent. So it's kind of like having your cake and eat it too, to some extent. So we'd have to talk about the enforcement part of it. I have spoken to the, as Commission's aware, the City of Napa staff does our actual implementation of our housing programs. And they're very frustrated and discouraged by the second unit affordability thing, just in terms of their ability to document it. So perhaps the approach to take would be to go with the 400 square feet, and then we could work at focusing on language on the implementation end to help assure that the unit does stay affordable and it's not kind of a bait and switch. But at this point in time, I wouldn't go beyond the 400 square feet.
Can that be tied to building fees, that we perhaps leave in an escrow account, and each year that they present rental documentation, those are released to them, or it's something that's charged back or a bill back over the life of that deed restriction?
That's an...
I'm terribly afraid that even now, if we do the 400 feet and it's deed restricted, it's just going to be a guest house.
But if it's in an escrow account and you start recouping some of that investment over the life of that deed restriction, and if they don't, not unlike what we're seeing with the Calderon, if we don't meet those requirements, we pay at the end. So you're motivated to.
Yeah. And those deed restrictions, you have to disclose them.
I'm sorry.
You have to disclose the deed restrictions, so it's not a casual thing to do a deed restriction on your home, and you have to disclose that when you're selling your home, and it goes with the home. It doesn't.
But just because it's deed restricted that it's going to be an affordable housing does not mean that you have to rent it.
I understand.
That's my concern, is that
Yeah, but if you deed restrict it for so long, it's got to be affordable that long, I think.
Yeah. So you can't rent it for.
You can't use it for other than that. I think for.
Well, you can still use it as a guest house, though. That's the thing.
I'm not sure.
Everyone's so suspicious.
It could be. You can't.
You can't make someone rent.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is you can't force someone to rent. So maybe I'm very hesitant on adding the 400 square feet back into FAR. I'd much rather do they don't have to have a garage, or have a fee incentive. I think that.
Let Mary Stevens say something. I think she might be able to help us with this.
Do you? Sure. Come on up.
Again, it's not to replace affordable housing.
I would suggest that the first thing we should do is do a real survey on the existing second units in St. Helena, not just the ones that have been built in this last planning cycle, but all the second units in St. Helena, and find how many are being rented at this point in time and what the rents are. So we have an idea whether this is a viable thing in our existing community.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
When the mean price of a house in St. Helena is $1.5 million, people are not building second units to have them deed restricted so that a senior can live there. Now, we might have some situations where that works, but I would like to see that quantified with real data before we spend all this time figuring out whether we're going to let people do this in the future, because they don't have to rent them. It's fine for the housing element, because that just says we can do this, but it does not give us affordable housing unless you can show me, unless we could all see the numbers.
And that's where my concern is right now, is that you don't have to force them to rent it. I don't really know where to go from here because I think that
Yeah,
it's a concern.
right. Obviously, we are operating under a time constraint, but that the housing element can always be, kind of modified and updated as we need to. I think it makes sense to go at least to HCD with something tying any sort of exemption or FAR bonus for second units to some level of affordability, to at least have that in there. And I think we need that because the Commission wants to, based on my understanding, the Commission wants to eliminate that FAR for second unit just as
Could we
as long as there's no affordability. So the survey is a good idea. It's going to take time. I would just, I guess, encourage in terms of responding back to council an approach where the 400 square foot exemption is only applicable to some sort of deed restriction at some level of affordability, and we could figure that out between now and the next commission meeting, and not look at going beyond that at this point in time. But I think a survey is a great idea, and then if we need to update the housing element or that part of it and the ordinances that implement it, we can do that.
I think it's really important too. I mean, as we're playing to the lowest common denominator, and I don't think everyone who would get their deed restricted for low income is going to cheat. They're not doing it. I mean, we're assuming that everyone's a cheater, and that maybe certain people will have an unethical approach to it. But we're punishing all. I mean, it's successful in these other towns.
But unfortunately, those towns don't have property values like St. Helena does.
Piedmont does. Oh, yes, it does.
I don't think with the high density of the low number of houses in St. Helena and the high property values.
Well, see, they're built out completely. That's why they use the second units for their affordable housing. There's no place to build. But it's very expensive.
It's very expensive in Piedmont.
I'm concerned. I'm sorry, I've been on this planning commission for over 4 years, and unfortunately, people do lie, and they do say that it's going to be affordable, and then it doesn't happen. And I don't want these houses to just sit here and be guest houses. I want them to be affordable housing if they're going to be deed restricted.
I agree with you.
So I'm very hesitant to open that back up again. Is there something that we could do that's more of the city, rather than giving a hard and fast number, saying working towards, second units being affordable housing via deed restriction, and not have it be so tied?
Yeah, there is a program in the housing element now. It's on page 14. It's program HE2.M. And it says link financial incentives and development standard variances to affordability requirements for second units. Require that either the main house or the second unit is used as a rental unit, which is already the case, but that is affordable to households with moderate or below moderate incomes whenever the city assists in development through financial incentives or by granting a variance. So
I'm very comfortable. I'm very comfortable with that wording, and just leave that there, and then
not go any further.
And do a survey of the second units. I do want to readdress the FAR with adding that to it, but I think that again, we have an empty room right now, basically, and I know that there are people that are pretty concerned with FAR and deed restrictions. So, compared to who was here earlier.
No, I know.
Yeah. Grace, you were going to say something?
Christine, can you tell me, the people that have a house with a deed restricted second unit, do they have trouble selling the house?
I haven't heard that it's a problem, but
I think that would be a problem if I owned a house. I'm just curious. It's just a question that popped in my head.
It certainly is something that somebody would have to, consider. Now, in Piedmont, they have a 10-year deed restriction on this. So now they've actually gotten to the point where they're having this issue of the deed restrictions are expiring, and now they're going to start losing, losing our affordable units. But that is why they made it for 10 years, because I think, generally people, I think the average is that you stay in your, home 7 or 8 years. I've heard that before, right? So, so they wanted to keep it at a, at least people can go into this kind of thinking that the affordability, the deed restriction will probably only last at least for the time that they're living.
So you
in the
can't do it like a
house.
Title 8 or something like that?
Oh, like a what? I'm sorry?
The housing over here for the seniors, you can't go back and get it the second time. You can't restrict it more than the 10 years.
Oh, well, they could, but there isn't any incentive for that property owner to go back and, get another deed restriction. I mean, they've already gotten the additional space or the waiver for constructing the
Do you know
parking
if it's
spot.
like Santa Cruz there? I know in Santa Cruz, if the person who owns the house wants to, not do affordable anymore, they can get it off their deed, but they have to pay the fees that were waived for the initial.
Well, that would be certainly some kind of a clawback that
Yeah,
would make
if they
sense
don't re-up.
if it was the financial incentive that was given. Now
Yeah.
they do in Piedmont have a
I think we should leave what we did to FAR.
I think we're saying just leave
Just
it
leave it the way it
the
is.
way it is.
okay. Oh, I was just going to say in Piedmont, if you want to have your deed restriction removed, they do have a process where you can petition the council to ask for that the deed restriction to be lifted. And I think there was, I don't know if there still is, a condition that you had to return the house, however, to its former state. So if you would have to, if you finished a space off, you would have to make it so that it's no longer habitable.
Yeah, but I can imagine here we could have it so that if you had it for 10 years, if you didn't re-up at the end of 10 years, you'd have to pay whatever waivers you were.
Tear it down, too.
Or
Just tear it down.
right?
Yeah.
Been
I mean,
here
those
too
are all
long, I think,
details that
tonight.
would be worked out.
Yeah, I'd like to just leave the housing element the way it is. I think that the financials or granting a variance, that is granting a variance is allowing more square footage to be on the land if need be, and financial is lowering fees, and I think that kind of is what we're just discussing right now, and I think just leave as is.
And not change the 400.
Until we get through all the zoning and everything and clean up all the municipal code, I think, wait, and I'm getting
And I think we can change this then.
and we can always, the thing is so nice is that we can always edit things. It's just, we need to get this approved, and be somewhat functional.
Okay.
Okay, commercial incentives though, for the on-site housing.
I'd love to see
Incentives.
that. I don't know if you can do it. I
Yeah.
think that would be wonderful.
I'm sorry, do we have a spot in here for commercial?
Yeah, if you look at page 13, program HE2.H, the second bullet does say something that's kind of similar to what we're talking about here. Analyze requirements that commercial projects provide housing for a portion of the employment that will be generated on site. The city will study and determine what portion of employment generated will require housing, what housing will be required on site or allowed off site, if pricing for the non-inclusionary units will be tied to anticipated salaries, etc. So this really is about kind of requiring commercial projects to provide on-site employee housing. It doesn't really talk about any financial or any incentives that the city would do in exchange for that requirement. This third bullet the third bullet does say explore development incentives, such as higher density and height allowances and a streamlined design review process. It's not really clear that that's tied to that second
I mean,
bullet.
I would love
So-
to see some of the hotel projects have, even 1 or 2 apartments for on-site staffing. I think that would be great. And if we could have maybe add verbiage of encourage that to be, and then have it be a fee incentive, or, it can be an escrow waive back of bill back. I mean, all those things, I think.
Maybe you could add to it.
This doesn't seem to be really like encouraged, it's just analyze, and I'd rather it be like,
I think they say,
we want you, hey.
Analyze that commercial projects provide housing for.
Yeah.
Well, why not add to that explore development incentives such as higher density and height allowances and a streamlined design review process and financial incentives?
And financial
I
incentives.
mean, you think? I mean, that, I think, would sweeten the pot a lot, perhaps.
You need to be specific and say fee waivers
Or fee waivers.
Or is
something,
financial
yeah.
incentives
Whatever.
sufficient?
Yeah.
Fee waivers. And then maybe say that this is,
Yeah, there's only,
Well, fee waivers, yeah, I guess.
property tax, we can't, so it's really all about fees.
Yeah.
really is.
but you know, if they do, you know, a certain number of units, then their in lieu fee gets lower and lower. You know, it could be proportionally or exponentially depending on how it goes. So
Well, and the city could also, you know, give, dedicate part of its housing in lieu fee, you know, fund.
Yeah.
To, you know, towards the project.
That's right,
That would be
yeah.
another financial incentive.
Yeah.
So then why don't we just kind of clarify to specifically say that this is for on-site employee housing as well as other types of, the other mixed use.
it does make sense that it's
work units.
on-site employee housing, just one less car on the road.
Right. Okay.
Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add?
No, were we going to talk about what the council wanted us to talk about?
That is what we were doing.
Is that it?
Yeah, just those, it was the, they're already contacting various owners of the site to identify affordable housing. We're starting that. The second unit with deed restrictions and being tied to incentives, and then the incentive for commercial developments, housing on job sites.
And that's deed restrictions for affordable housing, right? Specifically, deed restrictions for affordable housing.
Yes, yes. And the other thing is also is, I know that everyone else said this, but I just want to reiterate the why Adams Street and Hunter project aren't.
Can we put them back?
But they're not taken off.
Well, they're not exactly taken off. They were taken off of the high opportunity sites. So they were put onto that, the second chart. And so I think they're called resource sites. And it doesn't preclude development. It doesn't mean that development can't happen there. We're just acknowledging that there's issues with having those, and that we're not sure that they're going to be developed. They're no longer key housing opportunity sites. We're
Well,
not
I
sure
can
they're
see
gonna be
that for the
developed
Hunter
over
project, but
housing.
not the Adams Street. I'd really like the Adams Street to be moved back on as a high priority.
Okay.
Well, and
Well,
there are
Hunter
several
project-
properties on that list that are even less likely, that
I
the
mean,
owners have specifically said they won't
Last time they
build.
had
So
backstop
it
on
would
them, you
just,
know damn well they
it
ain't gonna
didn't
tear
make
out
a lot
that
of
building
sense
and
to
build affordable
identify the two that are most appropriate for a multi-unit location, and to take those off and yet leave.
Yeah, if I
Other
could just add, I agree with Chair Parker that the Adams one I think is fine. The Hunter one, it's a little more complicated because the project is controversial and
It's not city-owned property.
it's not city-owned property.
The
and-
lack of control over it, I think.
And unfortunately, but if, for instance, I'm just saying a hypothetical, if the city ended up in some sort of legal dispute with Hunter, and Hunter shows as a high priority site, that very fact could be used against the city, and so I think it. Just to be more neutral, the fact is it doesn't affect anything in terms of the ability of it to get built. It's simply where you put it on this list.
And we are trying to make ourselves not be vulnerable to lawsuits.
Right. So that's
Except it's been there before, and by taking it off, I think it makes a red flag a lot more than if you just leave it alone.
No, because there's been so much public outcry. I think it's obvious that it's on record that.
Well, and
there's
if
a
what
lot
Victor's
of
saying is it's simply shifted from the top of the pile to somewhere
sort of
farther
a
down.
kind of
more or
neutral
less.
category. It's not given a special dispensation that says, yes, this is a fantastic site. It's one of the best, and everything is, roses and full speed ahead. It could be argued that very way in litigation, and we have heard from the Hunter folks, and they indicated to us they'd prefer that it be back on the list. So I just feel, just get from a big picture standpoint, that it's best to leave it off, and it really doesn't materially affect it one way or the other.
I believe there's also, I'm not sure what the current status of this is, but there were issues with the environmental impact report. I don't have those been resolved, or those are still pending.
Yeah, it's still, it hasn't been approved yet. There's
So when
still.
we do environmental review on the housing element now for adoption, I think it would be cleaner to not have that listed on the
Right.
site.
That's a good point. The environmental document is still pending, is probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. All right. But if we can move the Adams Street back, I would like to do that.
All right.
Okay. Anything else?
Before we adjourn, you mean? Yeah, I was wondering if you guys were interested in this, so I can remember everything. I have to read it.
Thank you,
Okay.
Christine.
Oh, yeah, the current, this is about zoning and density issues. The current medium-density zoning in town, as we mentioned before, in many places doesn't reflect what actually exists there, and the medium-density multifamily by right use could potentially build out St. Helena to a population of 20,000, the way it is right now. I mean, obviously it wouldn't, but I mean, that's how it's zoned to do that. Multifamily units could be approved without city permission. The plan, but of course they would have to come before the Planning Commission. But litigation could be invited by resistance to the construction of these projects based on neighborhood inappropriateness if they're zoned.
Yeah.
Well, hear me out. If I didn't make this up, I got it from people who know.
No. I don't think it. I don't think it's on the agenda.
No, I know it. I'm bringing this up. I stick with me. I don't want to.
Okay.
On the agenda.
That's what I'm asking you to do.
Well, just telling what you want on the agenda.
I don't want to report. Just say what you wanted on the agenda.
I'm just giving the reasons. Okay, I'm just.
I don't give the reasons. That's
Okay, I'm giving. I would like to have a discussion of the housing of the zoning before the general plan update is complete, so that we can look at these and any changes we might make, we could incorporate it into the general plan before it is into the growth management.
Can't discuss it, Bobby.
okay.
I am
So
asking to put it on the agenda.
So what we
Just said he would.
yes. So what we can do is we can shoot for the next meeting if the commission's fine. Right now the agenda is fairly light, so we could have that as a discussion item if that's agreeable.
that's fine with me.
Should I not have said those things?
No.
No, it's just Bobby. You need to keep it you need to keep it light and just say you want it on the agenda because it is. That's all.
Okay, I
That's
just
all.
didn't know
And
if
then
you
you
guys
can
would
talk to him
agree.
about what
so
he needs to put in this.
It doesn't
package.
matter if we agree. You just ask
Oh,
him.
really? I don't need your agreement to get something on the.
Well, he just asked us for it, but you can say, "I'd like this. How do you all feel?" And that's it.
We said put it on the agenda.
Okay, so
Let's
you
not
would
discuss it.
Okay,
That's all
I
we
didn't
said,
want to
Bobby.
discuss it. I just wasn't sure that you would know what it was. All right.
And maybe we should have a Brown Act lesson. All right, I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Under my brown eye.
Just a last comment is what Christine and I will do, and Aaron we'll put together a summary of what all the changes we heard, and then run that by you within the next week or so,
Perfect.
just so
Thank you.
there's
Like
no
you did last
confusion.
time.
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right.